their feet. But you know what, folks? Iowans are a resilient people, and I know that they are up to the task. Since the first signs of trouble over a week ago, our state and local emergency response teams have been working together seamlessly around the clock to keep our Iowans safe. I credit Governor Reynolds and her office for quickly gathering damage assessments from all around the state in order to make a strong case to the president that a federal disaster declaration was warranted. I also want to thank President Trump for recognizing the gravity of the situation on the ground in Iowa and for swiftly approving our request. Nearly 60 of Iowa's counties will now have access to much-needed federal assistance. In the near term, our focus is on recovery efforts, and I will do everything in my power to make sure Iowans have every bit of the help that they need. We need to get our farms and small businesses back up and running as soon as possible so Iowans can do what they do best, and that's work hard and take care of their families. But as we move forward, I intend to review the Army Corps of Engineers policies and closely examine how they were applied throughout this flood event. It's important that we study and learn from events like this so that we can try to prevent these types of devastating events from happening again in our future. And once again, I just want to say what a heartbreaking and devastating event that this has been for so many of our Iowa counties, our Iowa families, and our Iowa businesses. My thoughts and prayers are with each one of them as we move through this event. God bless you all. Of course, God bless our great state of Iowa and our great United States. We are there for you. We are there with you. Thank you, Madam President. I will yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Madam President, I rise today to discuss climate change, which is a great crisis currently facing our country and our planet. Now, let me start with something that's sometimes controversial in this chamber, a statement, I believe in science. And here are 3 simple scientific facts. Climate change is real, it is caused by humans, and we are running out of time to fix our troubles. 3 more scientific facts. The ocean and the air are getting hotter, storms are getting stronger, flooding is getting worse. These facts are widely accepted throughout the world, but the President and Senate Republicans refuse to acknowledge these basic truths. Together, they routinely dismiss the impacts of climate change and deny clear evidence that we must take action. They refuse even to say the words climate change. That's not leadership. But here's the thing about facts. Refusing to believe them doesn't mean that they will go away. While a small handful, a tiny minority of my colleagues across the aisle acknowledge that maybe climate change is real, they say actually doing anything about it would just be too expensive. The problem is too big to solve, and we should just give up now, close our eyes and plug our ears again. But ignoring our problems has a much bigger price tag than the common sense solutions we should already be pursuing. Our coasts are threatened by ever stronger storms that can destroy our homes and devastate our largest cities. Our food supplies and forests are threatened by an endless barrage of droughts and wildfires. Even our naval bases are under attack, not by enemy fleets, but by rising sea levels. To my Republican colleagues, I say that our biggest problems have to be our top priorities. Instead of protecting big fossil fuel companies that continue to guzzle the polluting fuels of the past, we need bold vision and forward-looking leadership. I support a Green New Deal that will aggressively tackle climate change, income inequality, and racial injustice. I thank my colleague and my friend and good partner, Senator Markey, for leading the fight on this issue. You know, this is not the first time America has faced a so-called impossible challenge. Over half a century ago, President Kennedy said, and I quote, "No nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space." And he added, quote, "We mean to lead it." President Kennedy challenged our nation to lead the space race, and less than 7 years later, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. The impossible had become a reality, and America had led the way. It's time not only to challenge our country to tackle climate change head on, but also to lead the world in doing so. If we do not lead, then others will. China and other countries will win the race to define the green economy of the future, and we will lose those jobs forever. I don't accept the Republicans' argument that boldly addressing climate change and having the world's strongest economy are somehow incompatible. The exact opposite is true. Tackling our climate challenges will provide us with the opportunity to grow our economy and to protect public health. We can propel the United States to become the world leader in green innovation in the 21st century. We can address climate change and strengthen our economy by making major upgrades to our crumbling infrastructure, by building more resiliency along our coasts and rivers, by constructing more renewable energy, and by promoting policies that will spur new, innovative research. These investments will protect our planet and will create good jobs with living wages, strong benefits, and safe working conditions. Madam President, it is time for new ideas, not old ideology. It is time for innovative research, not tired rhetoric. It is time for groundbreaking science, not political stunts. It is time to roll up our sleeves and get to work on climate solutions because this crisis is upon us and it is time to act. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, I come to the floor today to denounce the Majority Leader's sham debate on the Green New Deal. Let's be clear. The Majority Leader did not call this resolution up for a vote because he thinks climate change is an urgent threat to our country. In fact, he has opposed nearly every congressional effort to confront the climate crisis. The Republican Party's political and financial ties to the fossil fuel industry are well known. This latest effort to attack senators demanding action on climate change with cries of socialism is reminiscent of the Red Scare, in my view. Give me a break. The Green New Deal is an aspirational plan to combat climate change, create high-paying jobs, and develop a more sustainable economy that allows communities, families, and individuals to thrive. This isn't radical. This isn't socialism. This is basic common sense. The truly radical position is the Majority Leader's insistence that we stick our heads in the sand, follow the lead of the corporate-backed interests funding Republican campaigns, and do nothing to tackle climate change. The status quo might benefit the Majority Leader, the Republican Party, and their allies in the fossil fuel industry, but it's deeply dangerous for our country. Climate change is already impacting our lives and damaging our economy. Annual weather-related natural disasters have more than tripled worldwide since the 1960s. When scientists at the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Big Island of Hawaii first confirmed that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were steadily rising due to the burning of fossil fuels. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the United States has sustained 139 weather and climate disasters, beginning with Hurricane Katrina in 2005, where damages exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of these 139 disasters, nearly $1.1 trillion. Last year, in 2018, the United States experienced the fourth highest number of weather disasters in our history, at the tremendous cost of 247 lives lost and $91 billion in damages. In Hawaii, last year we registered record-breaking flooding on Kauai and Oahu that resulted in more than $125 million in damages. That storm generated the largest 24-hour rainfall accumulation in American history at nearly 50 inches on Kauai's North Shore in a very short period of rainfall time. Residents of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands also felt the devastating impact of Typhoon Yutu, the worst storm to hit any part of the United States since 1935. It certainly isn't a coincidence that 2018 was also the fourth hottest year on record, surpassed only by 2016, 2015, and 2017. And we've already seen the devastating cost of climate-driven disasters in the first 3 months of 2019. 11 days ago, Tropical Cyclone Idai devastated Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, killing hundreds of people. It is already being called one of the worst weather-related disasters ever in the Southern Hemisphere. Closer to home, the Missouri River has already set record levels of flooding in Nebraska, Iowa, and South Dakota. Under current estimates, this historic flooding in the Midwest will cost at least $3 billion in damages to roads, farms, homes, and businesses. According to Texas A&M University climate scientist Andrew Dessler, climate change is exacerbating the flooding, saying, quote, "You can think of climate change as steroids for these rain events," end quote. And more is on the way. According to the Spring Weather Outlook, NOAA released last Thursday, more than 200 million Americans are at risk for some kind of flooding, with 13 million of them at risk of major inundation. Given the increasing intensity and frequency of severe weather events, many more states and communities will need disaster relief, something we're about to vote on later this week. And that's something we cannot and should not play politics with, disaster relief. Every community impacted by natural disasters should receive assistance in the upcoming supplemental appropriations bill, including Puerto Rico, the Northern Mariana Islands, and other trust territories. While these extreme weather events will continue to impact local communities and the American economy, climate change also threatens our national security. Like a large majority of the American people, senior national security officials and Department of Defense officials understand we can't just follow the majority leader's example and stick our heads in the sand to avoid the painful truth of climate change. In 2017, for example, then Secretary of Defense James Mattis told the Senate Armed Services Committee that, and I quote, "Climate change is impacting stability in areas of the world where our troops are operating." He also stated that climate change is a challenge that requires a broader whole-of-government response, end quote. In February, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats issued a new worldwide threat assessment that concluded that climate hazards like extreme weather, wildfires, droughts, and acidifying oceans are, quote, "threatening infrastructure, health, and water and food security," end quote, around the world. This means there will be more threats to our national security in an increasingly unstable world environment. Faced with a global problem that threatens our national security, President Trump, with support of the Republicans in Congress, announced he would withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accord. He has, in effect, abdicated America's global leadership role in the climate crisis, alienated our allies, and created new opportunities for near-peer competitors like China. At the same time as the United States embraced climate denial on the international stage under Donald Trump, China has stepped up to fill the diplomatic void. After the latest round of international climate talks in November, Canada's Environmental Minister Catherine McKenna said, quote, "When the U.S. stepped back, China decided to step up. The role China plays around the negotiating table can't be underestimated," end quote. In addition to its diplomatic efforts, China has made significant policy changes to reduce its coal use from its 2013 peak and to scale up low-carbon alternatives. China is now the world's leading producer, exporter, and installer of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. China isn't the only country on the global stage acknowledging the reality of climate change and taking steps to combat it. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, for example, has said, quote, "Climate change is a matter of both ecological necessity and economic rationality," end quote. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that, quote, "The effects of climate change are everywhere, and they are a constant reminder of the need to act now. While climate change is the biggest challenge of this generation, it also provides the opportunity to do better while growing the economy," end quote. Under the previous 2 years of their unified control of the White House and Congress, Republicans have repeatedly blocked any efforts to combat climate change. With Democrats now in control in the House, I'm looking forward to working with like-minded colleagues to demonstrate there are those of us ready and willing to act. Today, I'm joining Representative Barbara Lee of California to introduce the Women and Climate Change Act of 2019. This bill recognizes that while the negative impacts of climate change often impact women the most, they too often don't have a seat at the table when it comes to developing policy. Our bill creates a federal interagency working group that will collect data and develop policies and strategies to address the effects of climate change on women both at home and abroad. We need to empower women to tackle climate change. They need seats at the table. So long as Donald Trump and his Republican allies in Congress obstruct meaningful debate and action, states and local communities are taking their own decisive steps to combat climate change. Almost every state in the country has begun to experience the impacts of climate change. But as an island state, Hawaii is poised to experience some of the harshest consequences of climate change. Rising sea levels, combined with increased storm runoff, will increase coastal flooding and erosion, damaging sensitive ecosystems, infrastructure, and agriculture. According to research from the University of Hawaii Sea Grant Program, 70% of beaches in Hawaii are eroding, and 13 miles of public beaches that once were present no longer exist. Waikiki Beach alone generates $2.3 billion of Hawaii's economy every year and could be completely submerged by the end of the century. A warming ocean will increase bleaching and disease outbreaks on coral reefs, which currently support $360 million in economic activity each year. For Hawaii, a sea level rise of 3.2 feet, which could happen as early as 2060, will result in $20 billion in damage, the chronic flooding of 38 miles of major roads, 25,000 acres of land, and 6,500 structures rendered unusable or lost, and 20,000 residents displaced. The prospect of such widespread climate change-driven devastation has spurred the state of Hawaii to action. We have made a commitment to become carbon neutral and generate 100% of our electricity from renewable energy sources by 2045. And we became the first state to separately ratify the Paris Climate Agreement. 18 states and Puerto Rico have since followed suit. In addition to efforts at the state level, local communities, families, and landowners are taking their own steps to cope with the threat of climate change and adapt as necessary. Last week, I met with National Park Service officials, members of the National Alakahakai Trail Association, local government representatives, non-government organizations, and community partners, including Native Hawaiian lineal descendants, to learn how they are implementing what they are doing to lead community-based approaches to trail management and how the issue of climate change is threatening national treasures on our coasts in Hawaii. During my visit, members of the Kailapa Community Association created a plan to cope with decreased rainfall, coastal erosion, and other impacts on the ahupua'a, or division of land, that they've lived on for more than 12 generations. Families and communities in Hawaii understand the threat of climate change and are demanding we take decisive action to combat it. Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress should muster the political courage to do the same. But that is not happening anytime soon, quite the contrary. Instead, like so many ideas they oppose, Republicans have resorted to mocking and distorting what the Green New Deal does. They're doing it by their tried and true method, by scaring people. Donald Trump and the majority leader have invested a lot of time in attempting to justify their claim that the Green New Deal is going to ban air travel. What?
The senator's time has expired.
Let me conclude by saying that the Green New Deal is aspirational. To say that it's going to result in everyone stopping meat eating, it's like, what the heck? These are so-called facts that the opponents and the climate change deniers are saying about the Green New Deal is laughable, coming from the very people who deny the scientific fact of climate change. So I could go on, but obviously my time is up. We'll have more to say as we continue this so-called sham debate. But let's not continue to stick our heads in the sand. And because I'm going to need to, and I would like to submit for the record some remarks, a letter written by an 11-year-old girl in Hawaii who spoke at a climate change rally in Hawaii, and she was so articulate, and she said, this is like experiencing World War III for the young people.
Senator's
they
time
demand
has
the adults in
expired.
the Senate to do something about it and save
Senator's time has expired.
and address climate change in an appropriate way. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to be recognized for 6 minutes, please.
Without objection.
Thanks very much. Madam President, I rise again today to speak on an upcoming vote later on the Majority Leader's Green New Deal resolution. And to my colleagues, I would just say I think we have a serious choice to make. Either we can acknowledge the climate crisis that our planet faces and confront it head on, or we can turn our backs to it and walk away. I think the clock is ticking and we need not to walk away. While clear majority of Americans is calling on Congress to work together and address climate change, a number of our Republican colleagues, not all, have chosen to devote their time to deriding the Green New Deal instead of acknowledging the 800-pound gorilla in the room and crafting an action plan to do something about it while we still have time. Madam President, I'm going to offer, ask unanimous consent to offer a very simple resolution here in a few minutes. And I think my friend here from Wyoming is here to probably reserve the right to object to that, which is his right. But it's a pretty simple resolution. There's 3 parts to it. And the first part of the resolution that I'll be offering is that climate change is real. Second part of the resolution is we as human beings have a lot to do with this problem. And the last part of it is we ought to do something about it. We includes the United States Congress. And I've been asked a fair amount today about, well, what should we do about it? What should we do about it? And if you look at the Green New Deal, the first part of the Green New Deal, especially the findings, gives a pretty good roadmap that I think we ought to seriously consider. And I would just suggest some items that have come up before the Environment and Public Works Committee in recent weeks and months. Hearings that we've held could also help us figure out what the Congress might want to do about it. If we think climate change is real, and I do, and I think most of us do, and it's becoming a more urgent matter, not a less urgent matter. But what are some of the things we can do? I'll mention a few. I think most people believe that carbon dioxide contributes to climate change, and that is true. There are other pollutants that are a lot worse in respect to climate change than carbon. I want to mention a couple of them. One of them is black carbon. Where does black carbon come from? It comes from diesel engines. Think trucks, cars, locomotives, trains, boats. And if you've ever been at a traffic intersection and you have these big diesel trucks, they pull away from the traffic intersection, huge plumes of black smoke appear as they pull off. They include black carbon. Black carbon is more than 100 times more dangerous in terms of its climate potential than regular carbon dioxide. We have American-made technology that can be placed on diesel engines, all diesel engines, there's millions of them, to reduce by 90% those emissions, 90%. And we have a program called Diesel Emission Reduction Act, which helps to fund and make available monies for states and local governments and all and private businesses to reduce their diesel emissions, especially black carbon. That's one. Two, corridors. We have corridors that, think about a national highway system in this country, and think about through most of our national highway system, we don't provide for charging stations for vehicles that have batteries, electric vehicles. We don't have fueling stations for vehicles that are powered by hydrogen, and in conjunction with fuel cells create motivation and movement for all kinds of vehicles. We need to put money into tax credits and grants for fueling stations for hydrogen and for charging stations for electricity. We have an electric vehicle credit which is expired, and it needs to be, or about to expire. It needs to be extended. So the people in this country, when they're thinking about buying a vehicle, will consider buying an electric vehicle which doesn't put out any carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxide, mercury, or CO2. Another thing we can do is provide an investment tax credit, which Susan Collins and I have proposed doing for some time, where for the first 3,000 megawatts of offshore wind that are deployed, the investment gets a 30% investment tax credit. That's one thing we can do. Our chairman of our Environment and Public Works Committee is here, and he and I believe that another good idea, and we're joining this by Republicans and Democrats, is to develop the technology, which we think is very promising, that enables us to literally pull carbon out of the air, not out of a smokestack, but literally out of the air and turn it into something more useful. That's something we can do. We had a hearing, I think, on legislation. I think it was called the Nuclear Energy Innovation. Actually, I don't have the last name of this, but it's NEIC capabilities. That's what it is. Nuclear Energy Innovation Capabilities Act. And part of what we want to do is instead of running nuclear power plants and ending up with a whole lot of spent fuel, be able to have technology that the heat is so high in those nuclear plants that it use most of the spent fuel. And instead of having it stacked up around the country, we use it up and we create electricity from it. Two more things and I'm done. HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which replaced CFCs. CFCs put a hole in the ozone. They're a coolant, they're a refrigerant. CFCs put a hole in the ozone. They were replaced by HFCs. HFCs didn't put a hole in the ozone. Better for the ozone layer. Not good for climate change. Now we have a follow-on product called a successor to HFCs. Good for the ozone layer, good for climate change. And we ought to make sure that we pass a treaty here in this body so we can actually use that technology. Finally, the last thing we can do is provide for our auto industry something they're asking for.
The senator's time has expired.
I asked for 30 more seconds, please, Madam
Without
President.
objection.
Thank you. Last thing we can do, the auto industry has been saying, you know, with respect to fuel efficiency standards, CAFE and so forth, we ought to give them some near-term flexibility in terms of meeting more efficient fuel requirements, more efficient mileage requirements, and more stringent requirements going forward in the future. That's what they're asking for, provide certainty, 50-state deal, California's at the table. We ought to do that. Those are just a couple of things that we can do in Congress to actually address this, and not only are we successful in helping do good things for our planet, but we're also going to create jobs and economic opportunities.
Senator's time has expired.
Something that the chairman of our committee and I think, might just agree on. Thank you, Madam President. Madam President?
The senator from Delaware.
Now, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Environment and Public Works Committee be discharged from further consideration of S.J. Res. 9, that the resolution be read a third time and passed, and the motion be to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. And this is the resolution that says climate change is real. We have something to do with it as people on this planet. And 3, the Congress is part of the solution. And that is that in
Is
short
there
form
objection?
Is my resolution.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, many Democrats have called climate change the greatest challenge of our time. Representative Ocasio-Cortez in the House, she is the Green New Deal's lead sponsor. She calls climate change, she says, our World War II. She said, the world is going to end in 12 years. The world is going to end in 12 years, she said, if we don't address climate change. Senator Schumer said that climate change is an existential threat. When the Green New Deal was introduced just last month, Democrats lined up to support it, to co-sponsor it, to agree with it. Senator Markey of Massachusetts called it the kind of generational commitment, he said, that we need to transform our economy and our democracy. Like every Democrat senator running for president of the United States is a co-sponsor, every single one. When Leader McConnell called for a vote on the new Green Deal, Senator Schumer said, go for it, bring it on. Said it right here on the floor of the United States Senate. Presidential candidate Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, she agreed, saying that she would vote yes. That's how she said she would vote yes. We'll see what she does today. Well, Madam President, today the Senate will vote on the Green New Deal. All senators will have a chance to go on the record, a chance to show whether they support this radical approach. But it sounds like rather than voting for the Green New Deal that they introduced and they co-sponsored, it sounds like some Democrats are trying to run away from a vote on something that they have previously embraced. If so many Democrat Party leaders support the Green New Deal, why aren't they willing to vote for it and stand up behind it today? The answer is obvious. The Democrats are ducking the vote. But why? Well, the answer is pretty simple, Madam President. The Green New Deal is unaffordable, it is unworkable, and it is unpopular. When you add up all of the costs and the 10-year price tag of $93 trillion, that's enough to bankrupt America. The cost is astronomical. It would hit every American really hard, about $65,000 per family per year. That would empty just about every bank account in America. And I believe it would drive a stake right through the heart of our strong and healthy and growing economy. The Green New Deal would massively increase the role of government in our lives and the size of government, the expense of government. Madam President, let's be honest, the climate is changing. It continues to change. It requires a serious response. A serious response. The Green New Deal is not that response. This plan would eliminate fossil fuels. It would require 100% renewable energy, carbon-free energy, in just 10 years. Well, the goal is to meet all of our energy demands in the United States through, quote, clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. Well, we need more renewable energy. But the goal of going from where we are to where they want to be is absolutely impossible in the period of time outlined. Robert Bloom from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation wrote in the Wall Street Journal saying, quote, an all-renewable power grid is destined to collapse. America can't tolerate a collapsed power grid. Plus, it wouldn't solve the problem. Turning off America's economy won't lower global emissions. America is leading the way in reducing emissions. Reducing emissions. Since 2007, U.S. energy emissions have fallen by 14%, while global emissions continue to rise. In 2017, the United States produced just 13% of global emissions. China and India together, over 33%. So emissions are going to continue to climb until these countries take action. Emissions in the United States continues to decline. Shutting down our energy would also harm American workers. That's why major labor unions oppose the Green New Deal. The AFL-CIO labor union, which represents 12.5 million workers, says we will not accept proposals that could cause immediate harm to millions of our members and their families. I agree. Even former President Obama's Energy Secretary, Ernie Moniz, called the Green New Deal impractical. He said it would hurt American progress in reducing emissions. That progress came from innovation, not from massive government taxation and regulation. So Congress must continue to support technologies like nuclear power and carbon capture and utilization, things that we know make a difference. And we have done this in a bipartisan way in these areas. So I want to continue to work with Democrats to find real solutions. We have passed legislation in a bipartisan way for advanced nuclear power plants, for carbon capture, sequestration, using the carbon in productive ways, whether it's for medication, whether it's for construction products. Look, the Green New Deal is not the solution for America. It is a big green bomb that will blow a hole in our strong, healthy, and growing economy. That's exactly why Democrats aren't voting for it. That's exactly why Democrats are ducking and dodging and distancing themselves from this so-called Green New Deal, because it is a radical plan, and it's exactly why Democrats are running away from the Green New Deal. I think we're going to see it today, running away as fast as they can. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senator from New
would
York.
my friend from Wyoming who mentioned my name yield for a question or three?
Madam President, I know the vote is scheduled at 4 o'clock.
I'd ask
I'm happy
unanimous
to
consent.
answer a question.
Okay.
And I understand that this...
My friend from Wyoming said, I said, bring on the vote on the Green New Deal. I did. Not because I think it's a smart thing to do, it's a stunt, but it would finally get us to talk about climate change, something the other side has not done. So I'd ask my colleague three questions. I was gratified to see Leader McConnell answered them for the first time at his press conference. Does the senator from Wyoming believe climate change is real? Does he believe it's caused by human activity? And does he believe Congress ought to do something about it? Those are my three questions. I'd hope I could get a direct answer since my name was invoked.
Well, thank you, Madam President. As a matter of fact, and I would say to my friend, the senator from New York, he asked me those three identical questions on this floor about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And my answer today is the same as it was then, and you're welcome to go back to the congressional record. And I recommended to the senator from New York an op-ed I wrote in the New York Times in December that said, yes, I do believe that climate change is real. And yes, I believe that humans contribute to it. And yes, I believe we have a responsibility to do something about it. And I highlighted the role of innovation, not taxation or regulation, in coming to those solutions. I highlighted legislation that has passed the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee and even signed into law by the President. Something called the Future Act that works on capturing carbon dioxide and using it productively. We talked about a bill called the Use It Act, which is now coming through the committee. We are working on it as bipartisan support, passed last session, didn't get all the way to a signature. Talked about the future of nuclear power, the advanced nuclear power plans that are being done, and we've paved the way for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to do things because nuclear power has zero emissions. These are bipartisan pieces of legislation passed overwhelming support by the Senate, the House, signed by the President, and these areas, both carbon capture and nuclear power works, are things that actually President Obama's Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, testified to the Senate Energy Committee are the two things that actually can work at scale. And anything else that the United States, I would tell you, does unilaterally will not contribute to a solution because emissions from the United States are only 13% of all the emissions in the world. So, Madam President, I would once again recommend to the Senator from New York an op-ed that I had written about dealing with climate change through innovation, not regulation or taxation. And I hope in that way that I have answered the Senator's three questions. I would say to the Senator from New York that if he is actually serious about discussing climate change on the floor of the United States Senate and looking for solutions, then what he ought to do today is instruct his members that I believe he may have instructed to vote present, to vote to get on the bill, to get on this, to discuss it, to debate it. But it doesn't sound like even the co-sponsors are willing to stand up and vote for something that they have co-sponsored. A dozen of them had done it. 3 of them were leading a rally, Madam President, outside the steps of the Capitol within the last couple of hours, with one senator chanting about what about the Green New Deal and having a vote on it, and when do we want it, and the crowd is chanting now. It'll be instructive to see if that senator, and one of these was a candidate for president, see how they vote when their name is called, as the roll is called here, on today's vote on the Green New Deal.
The Democratic leader.
Thank you. First, I thank my colleague from Wyoming. Now he knows why I've said bring it on. We are finally getting even people like the senator from Wyoming to admit that climate change is real, it's caused by human activity, and we should do something about it. And if we could have an open debate on climate change, that would be great. That's not what's happening today. The senator from Wyoming talks about the contradictions of the senator outside. How about the contradictions of the Republican Party and the senators here putting a bill on the floor that they're going to vote no on? Let's put the bill that the senator from Wyoming asked for, and let there be an open amendment process, and let's see where people fall. All we are asking for is not a sham vote where every people who put the bill on the floor are voting no because they don't want to have a debate, but rather a real discussion and real debate and real amendments. And so I would say this, Madam President. Earlier today, even better than having the senator from Wyoming finally admit climate change is real and caused by human activity, the Republican leader did when asked by the press at his gathering. The whole plan of the Republican leader here is backfiring. We want a discussion on climate. We haven't had one major bill on the real issues of climate come to the floor, led by the leader, where we can have open debate. Not one. So now we're finally beginning to debate it. That is great. We're not going to stand for sham bills that the other side is all voting no on. They know what a trick and joke and sham that is. So does all the American people. But we are finally talking about the issue, and that is great. Because climate change is not a joke, it's not a hoax, it's a crisis. And that's why we're doing these things. So right now, Madam President, here's something else we could do. Let's see where our Republican colleagues are if they want to have a real debate. I am calling for the creation of a Senate Select Committee on Climate Change. It's a crisis. Ask the farmers in Iowa and Nebraska and Kansas if they think it's a crisis. Ask the people who've been subject to so many changes in the weather because the globe is heating up. They believe it's a crisis. The very least we can do is do what the House did and set up a select committee on climate change, bipartisan. The committee could be partners with the House committee, and we might actually get something done, not sham votes that everyone knows are a joke, a political joke. And so I am hopeful that we can do that. The reason for the select committee is clear. If there ever were an issue that demanded focus from this chamber, this is it. Climate change is an existential threat to our committee, to our country, and our planet. The last 4 years have been the warmest on record. Sea levels are rising. Marine life, fishing communities are being destroyed. Record flooding is inundating parts of the country, most recently the Midwest. And more powerful hurricanes have buffeted our coasts. Over the next decade, climate change will continue to negatively impact every part of American life. Our health, our economy, our national security, even our geography. And the threats will only grow. So we can't run into our ideological corners anymore. I am gratified to hear a growing number of Republicans admit it's real, admit it's caused by human activity, and that we should do something about it. That's great news, but let's do something real. Let's do something real. The senator mentioned a few bills. I'd be happy to look at them. I hope he'll look at ours, and I hope he'll ask this leader, his leader, the Republican leader, to allow an open debate on the floor with amendments. We'd welcome that. We'd welcome it. Some in the oil and gas industry won't like it, that's for sure. Some in the coal industry won't like it, that's for sure. But most Americans will. So let's do it. The time for partisanship on this issue is long over. The time for one party to block any change and not offer anything that they believe in is over. We need to act quickly and boldly to confront this challenge before it's too late. So it's time we stop the nonsense. As I said, we welcome this debate because we're talking about climate change for the first time, and the hypocrisy of putting a bill on the floor and then voting against it is becoming so clear to the American people. But as a byproduct, we're getting a debate. We're getting some of our colleagues for the first time to admit that climate change is real and caused by human activity, and we ought to do something about it. We welcome it. This committee will help bring the kind of bipartisan discussion that my good friend from Wyoming has asked for. And so, let's do it. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Rules Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-Res 97, a resolution establishing the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. The resolution be agreed to, and the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Reserving the right to object, and I would like to point out to my friend and colleague that the statement I had made earlier about my belief goes back a long time, that the climate is changing, to the point that one of his colleagues, Jeff Bingaman of New Mexico, chaired the Energy Committee when he and I co-sponsored legislation dealing with carbon and carbon capture and putting together an X-Prize type program. So this is something I've long spoken about and understand. I also hear the senator from New York essentially trying to strip the EPW committee of the jurisdiction we have over climate change. That's the wrong approach when we have made real progress working together, not just on bills, but on bills signed into law that are making a difference today. Madam President, this resolution is, that the minority leader has just introduced, is an attempt by the Democrats to once again duck and dodge and distance themselves from the Green New Deal vote this afternoon. The Democrats seem to think that adding a layer of bureaucracy is an answer to every problem. That's the same instinct that gave us the Green New Deal. The climate is changing. Humans play a role in the changing climate. There is no question in my mind about that. I'm going to continue to work closely with the ranking member of the committee, Member Carper from Delaware, to pass meaningful legislation to promote nuclear power, carbon capture technologies, and to reduce emissions. So Democrats can't hide from the fact that every Democrat senator running for president has co-sponsored the Green New Deal. Here we are today, Madam President, and I will just tell you, we've been passing bipartisan legislation. The Energy and Natural Resources Committee recently held a hearing on climate change. We do not need another committee. We don't need the Green New Deal. We need real solutions. And for this reason, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Would the senator yield for a question?
All time has expired.
I'd ask unanimous consent we be given 2 minutes so the senator from Rhode Island could ask a question of the senator from Wyoming.
Is there objection? Without objection.
I appreciate the comments of my distinguished chairman on the Environment and Public Works Committee, and I'm interested in his reliance on carbon capture technology, and I'm wondering what part of the carbon emissions problem he thinks that carbon capture will solve, because leaders of the carbon capture technology sector have said that it is their vision to capture 1% of carbon emissions. So what I conclude from that is that carbon capture technology is important, but to rely on it at the expense of the sort of action that we really need is profoundly misguided.
Well, Madam President, I know the time has expired. I would say we've had a hearing on this within the last couple of weeks. We've had an expert come who is in this specific area of carbon capture to show how much more effective the technology has become. This is something I started working on 10 years ago. It is something that researchers around the world are committed to because we're finding a value in that carbon to create products that can be used either medically or for construction. The University of Wyoming has an integrated test center right next to a coal-fired power plant. And the technology is there to take the carbon dioxide right from the stack and use it. Some for enhanced oil recovery, some for production, and they're continuing to work. And I believe in the science of all of this. Certainly there are the climate alarmists who are out there, Madam President. And it does seem that what they want to do is act immediately, drastically, and unilaterally in ways that will not solve the problem. It will hurt our country. It will hurt our economy. It will move the lifeblood of the United States economy to foreign countries. And I will do everything I can to make sure that that doesn't happen. Thank you, Madam President. I know the time has expired, and I go back to regular order and the call for the vote. Thank you.
I'm interested in the other 99%.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 27, S.J. Res. 8, a joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to S.J. Res. 8, a joint resolution recognizing the duty of the federal government to create a Green New Deal, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, No senator voted in the affirmative. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Cornyn, Enzi, Graham, Hawley, Hyde-Smith, Isaacson, Langford, Roberts, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Sullivan, and Young. Mr. Kramer, no. Mr. Romney, no. Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Cotton, no. Mr. Grassley, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Crapo, no. Ms. Ernst, no. Ms. McSally, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Kennedy, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Braun, no. Mr. Lee, no. Ms. Collins, Ms. Collins, no. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wicker, no. Mr. Daines, Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Perdue, no. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mrs. Capito, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Shelby, Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tillis, no. Mr. Gardner, Mr. Gardner, no. Mr. Toomey, Mr. Toomey, no. Mr. Moran, Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio, no. Mr. Jones, Mr. Jones, no. Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, no. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch, no. Miss Cinema, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, no. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, no.
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to vote or change their vote? Seeing none, on this vote, the yeas are 0, the nays are 57, and 43 senators responded present. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. The clerk will